the simple rule that made thinking abstract. At first, it felt like convenience, a shortcut to keep ideas organized, but it quietly changed how humans thought forever. To understand how thinking became abstract, we need to return to a moment when ideas were still tied to objects. Early reasoning was concrete. Numbers counted things. Symbols pointed to realities you could touch. Meaning lived close to experience. Every concept was anchored to something tangible, and reasoning could not travel far from the objects and situations that gave it purpose. This mattered because thinking itself was limited by what could be seen. Problems were solved through examples, stories, and physical reference. Knowledge grew by accumulation, not by generalization. Every situation felt unique, requiring its own reasoning and its own resolution. The idea that two different situations could be treated as instances of the same underlying pattern had not yet emerged as a systematic practice. Then a simple rule appeared, a way to treat different things as the same, as long as they shared a structure. Objects no longer mattered. Relationships did. A symbol could stand for any instance that fit the rule. At first, this felt empowering. One solution could apply to many situations. A proof that worked for one set of numbers could be extended to all numbers sharing the same properties. A principle discovered in geometry could illuminate problems in astronomy. Patterns emerged where exceptions once dominated. Thought became portable. Ideas could travel without dragging reality behind them. A principle discovered in one context could be applied in another without needing to rebuild the reasoning from scratch. This was an enormous leap in cognitive efficiency. But something profound shifted, meaning detached from experience. Symbols began interacting with symbols. Conclusions were reached without touching the world at all. Correctness no longer depended on reality, but on consistency within the system. A conclusion could be reached, validated, and defended entirely within the abstract framework, without any reference to the physical world it was originally meant to describe. This was both a liberation and a detachment. This was the moment abstraction was born, not as a philosophical idea, but as a practical rule. And once thinking learned to operate without reference, there was no going back. Thinking had crossed a threshold from which it could not return, because once the mind learned to reason without reference to specific objects, the power and efficiency of that mode of thought made all previous approaches seem inadequate by comparison. As abstraction took hold, thinking gained speed and lost texture. Problems could be solved without waiting for examples. Rules applied instantly. Conclusions arrived clean and elegant, untouched by messy details. This felt like progress. Abstract thinking allowed ideas to scale. Mathematics, logic, and later science all depended on it. One proof could settle countless cases. One definition could replace endless explanation. Knowledge accelerated, but abstraction also created distance. When symbols replaced situations, consequences became harder to feel. A conclusion could be correct while still being disconnected from lived experience. Errors no longer looked wrong. They looked inconsistent. The standard by which reasoning was judged shifted from correspondence with reality to coherence within its own rules, a shift so fundamental that it altered the nature of what it meant to be correct. This mattered because authority shifted. Truth was no longer grounded in observation. It was grounded in structure. If the rules were followed, the result was accepted. The question of whether the result corresponded to anything real, whether it described something that could be observed or experienced, became secondary to the question of whether the reasoning was internally valid. Questioning the outcome meant questioning the system itself. Over time, abstraction became invisible. People stopped noticing when thinking left reality behind. Decisions felt rational even when their effects felt wrong. Logic became persuasive on its own terms. A conclusion could be reached, defended, and acted upon without ever checking whether it matched the world it was supposed to describe. The internal consistency of the reasoning was sufficient to establish its authority. The conflict emerged quietly. Abstract reasoning solved problems that concrete thinking never could, but it also justified conclusions that common sense resisted. The power of abstraction to override intuition was not merely an occasional inconvenience. It was a systematic feature of how abstract reasoning operates, and it created persistent tension between conclusions that logic demanded and the reality that experience suggested. The mind learned to trust form over feeling. Abstraction did not remove intuition. It overruled it, and once overruled often enough, intuition began to sound unreliable by comparison. The conflict reached its peak when abstraction began deciding outcomes without accountability. Systems built on rules produced results that no one fully intended, yet everyone defended. The reasoning was sound. The consequences were not. The gap between formal correctness and real-world impact widened as abstract systems grew more powerful and more detached from the lived experience of the people affected by their outputs. This is the emotional breaking point. People realized that correct logic could still lead to harmful conclusions, that following the rules did not guarantee wisdom, and that abstraction had removed the friction that once forced reflection. Mathematically, nothing was broken. The rules worked exactly as designed. But design itself had become the issue. Abstraction optimized consistency, not meaning. It answered questions without asking whether they should be asked at all. This created a quiet crisis of trust. When outcomes felt wrong, explanations pointed back to the rules. Responsibility dissolved into structure. No one chose the result. It emerged. The more abstract systems became, the harder they were to challenge. To argue against them, one had to speak their language. Experience and intuition lost authority. Only formal reasoning counted. The knowledge that came from direct contact with the world, from years of observation and adjustment, was increasingly dismissed as anecdotal or subjective when it conflicted with abstract models. The conflict was no longer between right and wrong. It was between validity and relevance. And relevance was quietly being excluded from the conversation. The resolution begins when abstraction is no longer treated as an endpoint, but as a layer. Abstract rules are powerful, but they are not complete. They describe structure, not significance. Once this is acknowledged, thinking regains balance. This does not mean abandoning abstraction. It means reconnecting it to consequence, ensuring that the conclusions reached through abstract reasoning are tested against the world they are meant to describe, and that the people affected by those conclusions have a voice in evaluating them. Rules are tested against reality. Outcomes are questioned, not just validated. Logic is paired with judgment. The deeper lesson is subtle. Abstraction expanded what humans could think about, but it also narrowed what they paid attention to. What was gained in reach was sometimes lost in grounding. Thinking became abstract because it needed to scale, but wisdom never scaled automatically with it. That gap is still with us. Every rule simplifies. Every simplification excludes. And the question of what is excluded and whether exclusion matters is one that abstraction itself is poorly equipped to answer, because the act of abstracting is precisely the act of deciding what could be left out, and every excluded detail carries a cost. So, what do you think? Did abstraction make us smarter, or just better at ignoring what doesn't fit? The